All right, so in video number 2, we are going to pick up where we left off. And so it says a letter from Birmingham jail. The SCLC came to Birmingham, Alabama to help desegregate the city in 1963. This was likely the most violent city at the time. 18 racially motivated bombings from 1957 to 1963. Martin Luther King and Fred Shuttlesworth were arrested, along with 959 demonstrators. King writes the letter from Birmingham jail. The Negro is your brother in April of 1963. The letters defend the use of nonviolent resistance when confronted with racism and advocates the moral responsibility to break unjust laws. And he says it's better to take direct action than to wait forever for nothing to change. The letter greatly inspired more civil disobedience and pushed for Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act. Okay, then we get the March on Washington. This takes place on August 28th, 1963, and was organized by Martin Luther King Jr. 250,000 supporters marched on Washington, D.C. to support and end to Jim Crow laws, and that's segregation, discrimination, and racial violence. The highlight of the event was Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. And you can quick write, which form of protest do you believe was most effective and why? We see violence escalate, and the NAACP field secretary Medgar Evers lived in constant fear of the KKK in Jackson, Mississippi. He had regularly trained his family on what to do in case of a shooting or bombing of their residence. On the evening that JFK proposed the Civil Rights Act to Congress, K. Evers was assassinated. His assailant, Spyron De La Beckwith, was acquitted by an all-white jury twice before being brought to justice in 1994. On September 15th, 1963, violence escalates in Birmingham, Alabama, when the 16th Church Street Baptist Church was bombed. It's perpetrated by 4 members of the local Ku Klux Klan chapter. They planted 15 sticks of dynamite within the church, time to explode on Sunday morning. Killed 4 young girls and further served to intimidate the Black community. Okay, then we get the Civil Rights Act. So JFK was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. However, his Vice President, Lyndon Johnson, continued to push for the Civil Rights Act. This was signed into law on July 2nd, 1964. This outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It outlawed racial segregation in schools, employment, and public accommodations. This outlawed methods to tamper or prohibit the free right of voting. The earlier 24th Amendment, which was passed in January of 1964, already prohibited the poll tax as a requirement to vote. However, many southern states continued to defy the act, and activists continued to push back. In the Mississippi Summer Project, called the Freedom Summer, was organized in June of 1964 to attempt to register as many African American voters in Mississippi as possible. The project set up dozens of freedom schools throughout Mississippi to aid the local Black population. When one was firebombed, it was a Mount Zion Methodist Church. 3 civil rights workers went to investigate. Haymaker Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Caney were stopped for speeding, then later released after authorities notified the local KKK of their whereabouts. The Klan hunted them down and killed all 3. Seven men were charged with murder, but all were acquitted by an all-white jury. The SCLC continued to register African American voters, this time in Selma, Alabama. Despite over 50% of Selma being black, only 3% were registered to vote. Martin Luther King Jr. organized a march from Selma to Montgomery to protest for the constitutional right to vote. This 50-mile march was carried out by over 600 people, and it eventually grew to 3,000 people who marched. Many were attacked by police with billy clubs and tear gas. Bloody Sunday described the violence that took place on the first day of the marches. Alabama Governor George Wallace refused to protect the marchers. President Lyndon Johnson sent 1,900 members of the Alabama National Guard and many FBI agents to guard them. This led to the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which outlawed literacy tests to qualify for the right to vote. This provided federal funds to help register African Americans in areas that had less than 50% already registered. In Selma, the registered black population jumped to 60%. We're going to get into the Nation of Islam. So this was founded by Elijah Muhammad in 1930 and brought the Muslim faith to black Americans, as Christianity was often viewed as the white man's religion. He taught that blacks should take their rights by force instead of waiting for them to be given. Malcolm Little joined the Nation of Islam in 1952 while in prison for theft and changed his name to Malcolm X. He chose X because Little was the name given to his ancestors by a white man. He advocated for black supremacy and that whites and blacks should be kept separate in order to maintain their identity in their own institutions. He disavowed the Nation of Islam after a spiritual awakening and a trip to Mecca. He began to speak about racial integration and more acceptance. His break from the Nation of Islam brought many death threats until his assassination on February 21st, 1965 by 3 members of the group. And then we're going to look at the ending of the Civil Rights Movement. We had the long, hot summer of 1967, where 159 different race riots erupted across the United States in 1967. Atlanta, Boston, Cincinnati, Buffalo, Tampa, Birmingham, Chicago, New York City, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, just to name some of the major cities that dealt with these. The most destructive was in Detroit. It lasted 5 days and surpassed violence and damage of earlier the 1943 riot. President Johnson launched the Kerner Commission to investigate the causes of the riots. Its results showed that black Americans were frustrated over the lack of opportunity. The governments had failed to provide housing, education, and services to the black community. And so we had to see a call for new jobs and housing to be created. This was Lyndon Johnson's Great Society aims to provide many of these benefits. In March 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. traveled to Memphis, Tennessee to support the black sanitary workers in their strike for better wages and treatment. On April 4th, while on the balcony of a hotel, he was assassinated by James Earl Ray. More riots are going to break out across the United States. A third piece of legislation is passed. We see the Civil Rights Act of 1968. This banned discrimination in housing, illegal to prevent anyone from housing based on race, gender, religion, or family status. And you can quick write, in what ways was violence a constant threat in the Civil Rights Movement? What's the examples of that? How did the contributions of many lead to landmark achievements in the civil rights? And what will you need to happen for the new Civil Rights Act and Voting Act to achieve their goals? So this is the end of the Civil Rights Movement guided notes. So we're going to be, for the rest of the unit, we're looking at different activities that kind of go along to help support our further knowledge. Right? If you need anything, please feel free to reach out via email. And I hope you have a fabulous Monday.